in this computer. You are recording. Okay. So we have a long handout today. We had homework, untamed prayer. Did anybody have a chance to read through that thing? Thumbs up, anybody?
We did.
Okay, we got a couple.
Sort of.
Sort of, okay. First of all, you can go to this link and see the Frederick News Post. So it's in a newspaper. And this is written by Paul Mundy, who's the moderator for the annual conference for the denomination. And he sent this out earlier in an email to all the churches. And this one is a little bit longer. And I thought it was especially helpful for the division that we're in our nation. So that's why I thought it might be helpful to use this one. He starts off by going, I'm tempting to think of prayer as tame, but I don't go there anymore. So has anybody thought of untamed prayer? I named this one Untamed Prayer. Anybody thought of prayer as being tame or untame?
Well, it's easy to think of prayer as very passive, that there's nothing going on. You're just kind of sitting there and talking to yourself or talking to God, or whatever you're doing in your prayer practice. And it doesn't seem very active, and it doesn't seem dynamic or doing anything. So I think that's why we are tempted to think of it as tame.
Is prayer invisible?
Well, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Some things that are invisible we think aren't really real. Is prayer real? You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it.
So how do you define it?
How do I define prayer?
Yes.
I would probably define it spirit touching spirit.
That's interesting.
Or just how do we communicate with something outside of ourselves is prayer. So then Paul Mundy had this 22-month-old grandson who was accidentally burned, and then his whole world fell into this big black hole. So I'm assuming that some of us may have had a black hole in our life. Who has ever been motivated to pray when things were going bad in your life?
Sure.
Yeah. And suddenly, yeah, there's some more. What do they say? There are no atheists in foxholes. Has anybody heard that saying? I don't even know if people know what a foxhole is. Anybody know what a foxhole is? I guess we're the old enough generation. So that was a World War I term, maybe, because of all those trenches. I would imagine they were dug into trenches, and bombs were falling, and so they were lots and lots and lots of casualties. So there are no atheists in foxholes. I would be praying like crazy. Welcome, Lyle.
There's Gail.
Yeah.
Yeah, we found it.
Well, you joined your phone.
Are you at? So
We're at the cabin.
We have a question for you, Lyle. Where does the term foxholes come from?
The term what? Fox?
Foxhole.
I don't know.
We're guessing it might be.
Maybe somebody, it's, hide him like a fox, I guess.
Well, like World War One foxholes, there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah, that was more World War II. World War One, they dug trenches, I believe.
So there was more foxholes in World War Two. Okay, very good. So when you have something horribly wrong going on, we have this motivation to be in prayer with one another. So suddenly prayer doesn't seem so tame anymore. Maybe it seems a lot more active or a lot more um, necessary or relevant. So this is who do we pray for then when when we have a Bible? If we're trying to be faithful to the Bible, this is what Paul Mundy is talking about. He's saying that we need to be praying for those who are not even our friends, but who are very different than us. So he quotes the Good Samaritan story. So we thought we'd take a little bit of time to look at the Good Samaritan. And we have, first of all, what's a Samaritan?
What's a Samaritan?
Well, they're the people from the hills of Samaria, I guess.
People who grew up, who are born and raised in the hills of Samaria.
Well,
And
they were Jews who had married non-Jew people, some of them, and that's how they became Samaritans, I believe.
so Samaritans would have been the local people, the local girls, and these Jewish boys were hanging out with these local girls, and then they were getting married, and then the Jewish people were of Israel and Judea thought that was pretty horrible, evidently.
They made it against the rule to marry out of your race, and therefore they looked down on them.
Right. So they were not pure. So if I don't know if anybody's Harry Potter fans, but you had purebloods and then you had everybody else, and it's kind of like the same story over and over and over again. I don't know if we have pure blood brethren. There's some of that going around, so I don't know. So it's probably pretty prevalent. So what is written?
I've always thought of Samaritans as kind of like, I don't know, Baptists and Methodists. I mean, because the Samaritans have a lot of Jewish, quote unquote, it depends on your perspective, right? The biggest deal with Samaritans was they wouldn't go to Jerusalem, for sacrifices. So, I mean, if you want to fight about something, religion's a good one.
Well, just to prove the point that we've never been without something to fight about in religion. Every generation can find something to fight about, evidently. And it seems to change with the generations, but we still keep coming back to having religious fights. I don't know, Kathy, have I totally turned you off of the of being in a Bible study where we have to fight it out? Are you
No, I love the Bible study.
okay? Well, that's good. And I don't want to scare off Celia, so we're going to try to move forward here. So the question is then, what is the greatest law? Okay, so that's like a home run question. And they asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit life? And Jesus says, well, how do you, what is written in the law? Well, then the expert says, this is, you want to pronounce that, Dave? Shema? You're muted. You're muted, Dave. Uh-oh. Are you there?
I'm here. I get Vivian too now.
Oh, okay, good. Are you there, Dave? The Shema? Am I saying?
Sorry, I guess I was muted. Yeah, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel.
Okay, so that's the quote then is the most famous verse in the Hebrew Bible. So, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And so Jesus says, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live. And the law experts wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? So then we get to this great text that you might have read and heard or even acted out in Bible school, the Good Samaritan. So I was watching the video clip on the Good Samaritan, and that was, sorry, that was somebody else. That was Zacchaeus, but um, the Good Samaritan. Or I guess I saw a clip on YouTube. It says, that's an oxymoron. You can't be good and be a Samaritan. That's not even possible. So they were making that, it was so evil to even think that a Samaritan could be good that it was almost like a slap in the face. So what do you know about the Good Samaritan story? Anybody want to do a short version? Nobody knows the story. Okay.
I know it.
Well, then give us a short version.
Okay. First of all, the Jews did not like the Samaritans, so he's talking to the Jews that don't like the Samaritans. And when the Jews were around a Samaritan, touched them, they were unclean, so it was really bad. So there was this bad road where people got robbed on, and there was two different church leaders that didn't stop to help this guy that was beaten up laying by the road because they didn't want to be unclean, because being around somebody that was hurt like that was being unclean too. So they went right on. And then this Samaritan, who everybody hated, stopped, put some oil and wine on his hurt places, bandaged him up, put him on his donkey, took him to a hotel and told him to take care of him, gave the hotel keeper some money and said, when I come back, I'll give you money for whatever else I owe you, and went on his way. And then he asked the guys, who was the neighbor? And he said, the one that showed kindness to the guy that was hurt.
Yes. Okay, very good. So which of these three do you think was a neighbor? And the expert in the law said the one who had shown mercy or kindness. And so Jesus' only response to the expert is go and do likewise. Slap in the face for a guy who's a law expert who's supposed to go and be like a Samaritan. How rude and how offensive that might have been. So, looking at the questions then, these starters, what does this lesson have to say about who's in and who's out?
I think it said everybody should be in.
Maybe we think people are out, but Jesus wasn't going to have that in this story. There was not going to be the outcasts were not going to be the persons that were going to be demonized in this story.
Or the persons who show compassion are the folks who are in. The persons who love their neighbor as themselves, folks who are in, which doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity.
Right. So wouldn't matter your race or your religion or who you married, right? It would just be who would show grace, who would show mercy. So that puts a whole nother spin on the greatest on what is the greatest law. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your strength, and your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. So he wanted to say, who is your neighbor? Well, the one who needed compassion, it sounds like, in this place. So what would be the negative stereotypes about the Samaritan? I think Vivian did a good job describing that. We could call them, there's some great names that we could call them that we've been hearing in the news a lot from our president and other people about, what do you call, what do you call those others? There's lots of names for the others, and they're not very polite. So who would we say fits into that category in our culture today?
Some people would say the freeloaders,
Ooh, who's a freeloader, Larry?
those who do not want to work. They just want to get the government assistance.
Oh, that's one, yeah.
It's more of a problem for other people than it is for me,
Okay.
I think.
So there's no compassion for freeloaders, right? They're on the out.
It seems to be that way with lots of folks.
Okay. Well, we certainly hear that, don't we? Those people don't want to work, and if we give them $200 or $600, then they won't ever go back to work. I'm not sure there's evidence to support that, but that's what's out there. Who else is in that negative category?
To me, it seems like the people in that category would be people who radically disagree with me politically, religiously, or in some other fashion, particularly those that I have the most difficulty understanding.
Right. So, dagger to my heart there. Sorry about that, Fred. I think you nailed me too on that one.
Oh, didn't intend to do that. No, but I just mean it. It seems to me that whenever you hear somebody characterized in a negative fashion from any individual, it's because there's a lack of understanding of the differences between those two individuals. And I think that occurs on a number of levels, financial that you just talked about, but also, I mean, look at us religiously, look at us politically. It seems to me that any one of us would categorize a number of people in a negative light depending on where we are at a given time. And the problem is trying to figure out how to get from where, or speaking for myself, how to get from where I am to being able to understand, well, first tolerate, and then understand those that radically disagree with me.
Right. We have in our country, whenever there is an act of terrorism, then we have a whole nother category of people who are kind of like fair game. They're attacked, they're beaten for no cause whatsoever, just because of their last name or their heritage or whatever. We go through cycles of that a lot.
I think any time you consider somebody the other, and then you have labels for them that your mama would not appreciate hearing, or your classroom school teacher would say, we don't say those things here, then I think, yeah, we all have a way of participating in that. I participate in that, speaking for myself.
I kind of bristle when I see the word native plastered on somebody's car.
Oh, Colorado native? Is that the,
I assume that's what they're tooting their horn about.
okay.
I assume it's not saying that they're American Indian native.
Right, I would guess not.
In other words, to me, it's kind of saying you're not wanted, you're not needed, go on, go away.
Yeah, you're on the outs. You're in the out group because you're not a native, right? Well, I mean, look at our marches in the street for um, people who are feeling on the out. You know, there's no economic justice for some. There's no um, as as we were hearing last week. Um, there's no, not even a loan and a loan company for you if you're the wrong color or in the wrong path. So that's what Kathy was sharing. So there's always um, there's always people who have been pushed out for no reason other than um, in and out group. You know, you're in, you're out.
I think that
Um,
applies today for a lot of our immigrants.
Immigrant community, yeah.
Don't
And
the ins and outs change sometimes as a result of circumstances? I mean, we may be, you and I may disagree about something and be bitter enemies about it, and then a third event happens, and then all of a sudden you and I are best buds because we have a common enemy. And it seems like that, you know, I mean, right now our country is very much at odds within, but if we were attacked by an outside nation or something of that nature, my suspicion is it would pull us together in spite of our differences.
yeah, that has statistics and research behind it. It's called an outside enemy, yeah, and it certainly pulls together people in harmony. It seems to me like we have an outside enemy called coronavirus, and we never got to the pull together part for some reason.
Well, but I think part of the reason that we're struggling with the coronavirus issue is, again, there are ins and outs. There are those of us who believe that that this is a serious issue and dangerous to our country, and there are others who think this is just a myth. It's just the flu, and so there's kind of an in and out group there as well.
Right. Yeah, well said, Fred. Native Americans, all this talk about changing the names of teams, you know, that's an in group, out group. You know, you're someone I can borrow or take your culture and not take seriously. You know, all that stuff has been in the news, and it's been in the news for a long, long time, but it finally seems to be having some um, change that's come along with it. So, Celia, you're from a different um, country. You might have some more thoughts as a person who has seen the ins and outs, maybe.
Um, where I come from, everybody's Black. So we don't really have the type of racial tensions. I mean, when we see people who are not Black, they are usually from some international organization, whether it's the Peace Corps or something, working for a couple of years and then they leave. And I don't think they don't stay long enough to sort of become integrated into the society. So we don't, have that. I think what we do have, though, I would say we have a bit of classism. I think we are, because everybody is the same color, I think there's sort of like, well, if you are from the rural area and, maybe you don't have a car, you're a little bit less. But here I am, I live in what is the city. And not only do I have a car, but I might have AC and whatever. And I found that in school a lot when we had kids who came in, especially in high school, because for the most part, the high schools are in the in the town, in the city. And in the rural areas, there's just the elementary school. So if you got to high school, you definitely had to come into town. And then you had to live with someone because you couldn't make the journey back and forth every day. And I found that in high school, even if it was a Catholic school, which is kind of, you would think it would engender more like equality and sort of like Christian caring for each other, we were so mean to the other kids. And, you know, when I look back, I realized what a horrible, horrible little girl I was, picking on these kids. But it was, you know, you wanted to be in the in crowd, so to speak. So of course you went along with your friends and you did those sort of horrible things. And, you know, now I feel bad about it, but definitely in terms of what we were talking about, there was really the in group, and you worked so hard to be part of the in group, to be accepted. And these poor kids who came in from the rural areas, we just made their lives a misery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, welcome to school with children of every age. I think they seem to be really good at being cruel. I don't, that's, so you want to say what country you're from? That would be interesting for.
I come from an island, Caribbean, the West Indies, called Dominica. It's not the Dominican Republic. It is just a much smaller island way down south, and it's in between the French islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, although we do speak English because we were a British colony for a very, very long time.
Yeah. So Dominique, the island. So I think that's so cool. Learn something new every day. It's like amazing. There's an island called Dominique. So here we are. So part of this, you know, negativity is then, if we're taking Jesus seriously, then it's saying that we need to do some of that changing, and not continue in our past patterns that we all grew up with, and figuring out how to be the in group in school and how to not be in the out group, for heaven's sake. So and Paul Mundy is going back to this topic of 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 untamed prayer. So think of a time when you were in trauma. Did persons offer to pray for you? And I think Larry certainly has had a traumatic brain tumor that was a testimony to some of that. You want to say anything about that, Larry?
Well, the interesting thing was that I don't recall that I spent a lot of time in prayer when I was lost for almost 2.5 days. I guess my brain just wasn't working well enough, except I do recall when I did see that sign that said, prepare to meet your maker. As I was driving, I did say, God, I'm ready if you want to take me home.
Oh, so Larry was in a vehicle supposed to go to Chicago, and he ended up in what state did you end up?
I ended up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I'd driven over 1,100 miles in those 2.5 days on about 2 hours sleep.
Yeah, and so a miracle that he was found by his niece's husband, I think it was,
That's correct.
in a Walmart.
In a Walmart store at a telephone booth.
Yeah, so some so maybe Donna, you want to say anything about the other people praying for him?
Were a lot of people praying, it seemed like, because I worked in a Christian school. So, of course, all of my school was praying for him. Our church family in Mount Morris was praying for him. And we had an interim pastor, Pastor Dooley from Elgin, and so that prayer chain was started. Our girls belong to different churches here in Colorado, and their prayer chains were activated. And Nigeria missionaries and Nigeria people have an awesome grapevine that gets prayer chains going too. So there were just an awful lot of people praying for him.
Right. So, could can we, we have evidence that that's the result of prayer, that Larry was found? Can we go to the court of law and say, Larry, we know that you were found because of prayer?
I'm a firm believer.
Yeah, it seems like way, way, way too coincidental that you would be found in Wisconsin by a relative without.
Who didn't know I was lost?
Oh man, yeah, amazing. So anybody want to top that? There's lots of stories about how we have found prayer to be an important part of our life. I think yeah, lots of coincidences that we have had worship services that we've called God incidences, where you just can't explain them, and people all seem to have a story, not just one person, but another person, another, and another, and another. Anybody else want to share experiences where you just don't explain it away?
When my wife was ill on several occasions, and on three of those occasions, there was no reason to believe she would continue to live. And I believe that prayer had a lot to do with her ongoing survival. Now, the last round she had with cancer, she didn't make it, but she had three instances in which I think it was really God's intervention that kept her going.
Yeah, maybe beyond what the doctors could explain, right? Yeah. So then, anyone else want to share? I don't want to move on too quick. So then, George Stewart says that prayer calls forth God, making a way for God's decisive power. God can show up and exercise energy without our prayers. After all, God is sovereign. Why then is prayer necessary and vital to our communion with the Almighty? We have some theologians in our midst. Why is prayer necessary?
I'm talking a little too much here, but I guess as I've grown older, it seems to me that prayer maybe has more to do with me than it does with God, in the sense that when I pray, I'm trying to figure out where I am in relation to God and trying to get a sense of how I need to change or how I need to be different. Um, I guess for me, it is a way for me to work through who I am and what I am, and try to get on a path that I would hope that would be God's will.
And maybe a prayer would say, am I on the right path, Lord? Am I going in the right direction?
Exactly.
Has anybody else prayed that prayer? Yeah.
I remember, I think it was in my grandfather's house, there was the picture of Jesus kneeling. It was nighttime, it was bright blue background, lots of stars. And it said, prayer changes things. And what I think is, it's what Fred said, is prayer done rightly changes me.
Right. So, in Fred's case, prayer did not cure his wife from cancer. And where did I read somewhere that says prayer is either getting God's answer that we want, or if we knew everything God knew, we would still get the answer that we received, that maybe God had some other idea that was smarter than us.
One of the things that I read in a Seventh-day Adventist magazine was where Abraham Lincoln's aide asked him during the Civil War, asked him, is God on our side? And the president said, that's the wrong question. The question should be, are we on God's side?
Boy, I remember hearing that in the first Gulf War. Boy, oh boy, everybody was trying to say God is on our side, God is on our side, but there was some few voices that saying, wait a minute, are we on God's side? So if we don't have communication with God, then we're not going to have prayer, right? We wouldn't have any, there wouldn't be any reason to pray if we weren't going to try to talk to God.
I think prayer opens the door for the Holy Spirit to enter our lives and become more involved.
Rather than breaking down the door with an axe or a hammer.
It draws us closer to God and the Holy Spirit.
Right. So then
We
we
mean,
go ahead.
we may not see it immediately, but later on we say, wow.
Right. Right. And one of the assignments is sometimes looking backwards and seeing, was there a Holy Spirit working that you weren't even aware of at the time? Has anybody had that kind of experience? You didn't see it at the time, but you saw it looking back? I like to think that our members who have, how did we all get drawn to this Bible study? Did someone force you to come? Is there any reason that we're all here together? Is the Holy Spirit working to say, there might be something that is that can be helpful in your life in the midst of a
I would say
pandemic?
yes to that.
What? Go ahead.
I said I would say yes to that. When I think of this Bible study, and no offense to everyone, I think there's like 250 to 270 years of faith that you guys have, and I just absorb it. I'm serious.
That's a very descriptive way of looking at us. I've never looked at us that way before.
I mean, Vivian, Lyle, Donna, Larry, you, Dave. I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like a huge sponge on Wednesday nights.
SpongeBob, Sponge Kathy.
Yeah, not SpongeBob.
Well, that's interesting because who in your life was a guide who had been a person who studied the Bible that was smarter than you? Can anybody name a person who was studying the Bible before you came along? There's parents, perhaps, Sunday school teachers. Vivian, who in your life who was studying the scriptures ahead of you?
My parents. Sometimes we'd have Bible reading at night at the family. We always went to church, Sunday school. We had Sunday school teachers, pastors. that would, and then other people that were in the study groups, the Sunday school classes, and their ideas. And then, of course, Lyle, after he's been to seminary, I learned a lot from him. And and the pastors we've had as a grown up.
Yeah. So do you feel like they were on the journey, and you're soaking in some of their knowledge too, as like Kathy said?
Yes, very much so. Let's see. I was just trying to remember this guy's name. I just said to Lyle the other day, every time he teaches something, we seem to learn something. I seem to learn something from him. Oh boy, I can't bring his name to, but he's taught things at the nunnery in Western Kansas.
Oh,
Jeff Bach.
Jeff Bach.
Jeff Bach.
Yeah.
It seemed like when he teaches something, you learn something from it. He has a down to earth way.
Right. He's a Brethren preacher and scholar. Yeah.
Right. And studies a lot of the history and the beliefs of the Brethren Church in the past and stuff.
Right.
So.
Thank you, everyone. So one of this number 3 was the one that drew me into this Bible study. Question number 3. Someone want to read that out loud for us?
One expression of trauma is polarization, as many migrate to the extremes, huddling in camps or tribes. Examples: conservative, liberal. What first steps might we take to move from extremism to empathy, seeing each other as neighbors despite our differences?
So Fred had us starting on that vein, thinking about how do we try to get empathy. Start with empathy. How do we do that? How do we start that?
But to me, some of it would be learning more about that person and how they were raised and what environment that they were raised in. And even definitions of the words like conservative and liberal, when you really ask, okay, what does that word mean? I'm not sure I understand what that word means. To me, the start would be to see where that other person has been and try to walk in their footsteps a little bit. You may not end up agreeing with them at all, but at least you would understand why they view things differently than you do.
Right. I was having a conversation with a mentor of mine, and she had a person who was in her church community, but they were a very strong Trump supporter, and they were Church of the Brethren, and so she just wanted to know, can we have a moment to have a conversation, because I'm really curious, what is your thinking about what is drawing you so compellingly to this person to be in support of him? So she did this with curiosity and not revenge or attacking, and she was seriously curious, and she found out that he grew up in a rural area of the state where they were living, and it became very clear to her why he was very much a Trump supporter. Everybody around him, everybody in his family, everybody in his community was seeing things exactly the same way as this man, and who now lived in a different part of the state in her church community. But it certainly took out a lot of that animosity when you figured out where he was coming from. Has anybody done that at the dinner table at Thanksgiving with their family? maybe not a good place to start.
I was thinking about how often it's either or thinking. It's one of us has to be right, and one of us has to be wrong. That kind of yeah. I don't recall where I saw this, but there was a church. So someone was telling a story of a church that was just divided over issues, and they just finally decided they were going to pray with each other until they had a breakthrough, and whatever that took. And I mean, that's not the first thing we often do whenever we have issues. We don't pray. We kind of fight with each other or whatever. A lot of times.
Right. Our first inclination may not be to pray for people we disagree with. So these discussion starters were sent to the denomination several months ago. I think it was early spring. And then this article that is a little bit longer came out in summer. And this is what the challenge then that Paul Mundy has given in this newspaper article. Does someone want to read this paragraph that says, "And so, a challenge"?
I'll read it, Gail.
Thank you.
And so a challenge. Think of a person in your church life you're at odds with, a person from whom you're divided and distant, perhaps in a different camp or tribe. Then for the next 90 days, add that person to your prayer list and pray for them by name, in Jesus' name. I can't detail outcomes, but I do know, as George Stewart affirms, a new situation will be created.
So has anybody done a prayer like this for 90 days? I don't think I have. So we had a difference of opinion at our district conference where we had tribal warfare, tribal differences. And, but we didn't necessarily have to put anybody in an enemy camp. It was just that we were seeing things differently. So what can we learn from that? And Vicki was in the middle of it. I don't know if you want to say anything, Vicki.
Well, the thing that was at work for me, at least in part, was my title for the year was moderator. And so I took that term, moderator, very seriously in the sense of how do you moderate things? How do you stand in the middle between? How do you find a place that creates a place for everybody? And so that was at least part of where I was coming from and what my effort was about. Success of that is questionable, but that's at least what I was thinking. So, because I knew that we've been pushing away rather than drawing in. And so how do we draw in others?
We were looking more like the nation, following in some of those footsteps where people keep going further and further apart, I think. How do we stop that as a church? Why would we want to be in tribes as a church?
It seems to me like we need to find ways to bring some of those folks that feel like they're on the outside into positions of leadership, or at least on the advisory teams and so on.
So have some inclusion to offer. That was part of the tension, I think.
Right, and in my mind, I think maybe the gifts committee made a mistake by putting a bunch of old people from McPherson on the ballot.
I think a lot of the schismatic problems that we're facing now have been building for a long time. I've known a bunch of the folks on the end there, but if you have congregations in the southeast on the Atlantic seaboard who get all upset because of what's going on in a congregation in Oregon, you've got, people saying, you must think the way I tell you to think. You must do what we tell you to do. And that's hard to deal with. And I think it's been coming for a long time for some of the ones. So I don't have good answers. We've had, when I was young, why it was the standard version and the World Council of Churches, and they were being accused of being communist. And much of that same thing is now an undercurrent. It just they change what they're after.
So the flavor of the month changes, but the issues continue sometimes.
It seems to me that humility is built into this in a big way if we're going to change up, because I happen to know that my views are right. I'm not going to think the wrong thing. I'm going to think the right thing, right? So of course what I say is right, and it's in clear contradiction to what somebody else thinks, who is going through that same thought process of course they're right. They're not going to be thinking wrongly. They're going to be. So it's like there's a bit of setting aside ego. There's a bit of setting aside judgment and practicing empathy and compassion and kindness. And I think it all wraps right back around loving God and loving your neighbor. And how do we actually implement that and make that work? And I mean, we fight about that. We still are fighting about who's our neighbor and who's in and who's out. So yeah, we're just doing same old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. That, I mean, when I look at that Good Samaritan story, that who is my neighbor is a key question. And, there's that, so that his article there, he says, to do that for 90 days, it reminded me, I just came across this recently. The Message, Eugene Peterson. We've talked about him some, and, and he talks about the Psalms as being important, but I guess he passed away about a year or so ago. At his memorial service, one of his sons said, my dad kind of fooled people because he only had one message, and he used to go into his room. He said for 50 years the one message was this: God loves you, God's on your side, God's coming after you, God's relentless. I mean, that's just just to think about that in terms of what that would mean if we thought of our neighbors that way, really would change a lot. To me, it seems like it would change a lot of the things we think we have to fight about.
Well, Dave and I listened to a podcast by Ron Sider. I don't know if anybody knows, an evangelical Christian, and he was talking about having a little bit of humility, because some of the greatest Christian thinkers of the world didn't get it right. For example, Martin Luther had a whole lot of prejudice against Jewish people, which wouldn't really match what we're trying to say here. And so even someone who got so many things right didn't get them all right. So maybe there's a little wiggle room that maybe I'm not correct on everything and the way I think I am. as Vicky said, I know I'm right. But if I'm praying for 90 days, that might change me a lot. If I, so, Larry, you had something you wanted to say? Did I? No? Okay.
No,
All right. Well, I think what I want to do next week is send out this sermon by Dennis Webb, who's a pastor. Oh, I forget which country. Jamaica, I think it is. Does anybody know? I mean, he's a pastor in Illinois, but he's originally from Jamaica. And his sermon title is called Defending the Priest and the Levite. And he's taking the story and putting a whole nother spin on it. And so I was very fascinated by what he came up with. So to continue this theme another week, I might be doing us good. We have to pray for a priest and a Levite for the next week or so. Someone who's who didn't get it. So maybe if that's okay, we'll have that as our theme for next week. Can you see? If I send a link, will you be able to have that come up? Everybody's got access to internet, I think. Yeah. All right. Well, anybody have some words of wisdom here for the end? Thank you for coming.
thank you for your leadership.
Well, happy to be here. We are. It seems like we knew a whole lot of things before the coronavirus hit, and now I'm not so sure we know so much after all. So maybe God is smarter than us anyway.
You're
So,
very creative.
who, God? we,
God is blessing you with being creative.
well, good. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and hope you have a great week. And we'll hope to see you next Wednesday.
Thank you,
Take care.
Gail.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.